Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. Happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock. Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. Happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
It's almost time, kids. The clock is ticking. Be in front of your TV sets for the Horathon. And remember the big giveaway at 9. Don't miss it. And don't forget to wear your masks.
Welcome to the JD Oliva project. That would have worked a lot better if I forgot the overlay was still on. Welcome to this edition. As you can see, I'm coming to you not from the normal studio, but from school. I'm taking out my lunch period, and I'm going to do a little Patreon content for you. Let's not forget, I should say, the reason for the season. It is Halloween time. And as a horror connoisseur and as a horror author and dude who's generally into spooky stuff, I kind of wanted to do something a little different this month for the Patreon content and give you some horror movie recommendations. And my picks might be different than some other people's picks because being a writer, I tend to think about this stuff differently. Like I don't evaluate horror movies based on how much gore there is or, how many jump scares there are. I'm a big character driven story kind of guy. Like I'm into kind of a movie that's going to make me not necessarily think, but movies that are like good and well made and smart. So right now, here are my top 10. And I got this not in any specific order, but here are the categories I have. So I picked different categories, and here are some stuff that I would recommend to you giving a watch this holiday season. I did some cool stuff with this one. This is definitely video exclusive content. I don't know how well this is going to work in audio form, so we're giving this a whirl. So right now, we got our top 10 Halloween horror movies. First category, we're going to go with the no-brainer, the most obvious choice. I hate slasher movies to start with. I think they're brainless. I think there's no story involved in them. I don't care for them at all. However, in 1978, John Carpenter went out and made the slasher movie that became something that every other movie in the 1980s really tried to emulate, and most of them fell far short of it. And that's, of course, the no-brainer type choice for this time of year, Halloween, right? It's a story of a little boy who goes on a murderous rampage and kills his sister and spends the next 10 years in a mental institution. And then Halloween night, he gets out and goes back home to do it one more time. And this is the original John Carpenter movie. We're talking before Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, was thought of as his sister, before he was a supernatural entity. Although I would argue Michael Myers has always kind of been a supernatural entity. This is just a story of one crazy person coming home. And it's the tropes and stories that are set in this movie become the foundation of everything that kind of goes for the next 20 years, 20, maybe even 30 years, as far as the slasher genre goes. And it's a really smart movie. It's still spooky. It still holds up to this day and is a good film. And like I said, Michael Myers isn't the druid creation, unkillable machine. He is a guy, but there's something a little bit more to him. Like I said, Carpenter never refers to him specifically as Michael Myers in the script. He's the shape. And I don't know, man, there's something about this movie that holds up really, really well. And it's smart. Everything that came after this was trying to be this, but not everything did nearly as good a job. So I can't say enough good things about Halloween, the original Halloween movie, the night Michael Myers comes home. Next, werewolf movies. This is my recommendation for a werewolf movie. Here's the problem with werewolf movies. Most of them are god-awful terrible. There's not a whole lot of good werewolf movies. Most of them are dumb. They have bad special effects. They're not smartly written. The one exception to that rule is 1981's American Werewolf in London. American Werewolf in London is the story of two backpackers going through England on holiday, and they get attacked in the murky woods by a werewolf. One of them dies. One of them moves on to become a werewolf. And our hero, who becomes a wolf, is haunted by the ghost of the friend that he murdered, who's kind of telling him what's happening. And though our hero kind of denies it. Every night he's turning into a werewolf and causing troubles. And at the same time, he falls in love with an absolutely beautiful nurse played by Jenny Agutter, and just a fantastic performance here. And this is a really smart werewolf story. There's a moon theme that goes along, especially with all the music choices. Music plays a huge role in this movie, and there's some really innovative camera work that's being done. But the thing that stands out the most about American Werewolf in London, and I think that holds up fantastically, is the Rick Baker created transformation sequence. There's never been a transformation sequence in a werewolf movie done better. And it's all practical effects, and it all still holds up, and it looks great to this day. So I can't say enough good things about this movie. Like it's still to this day probably my favorite. It's definitely my favorite werewolf movie. It's a huge inspiration on my book, Harvest Moon. Like it's the best werewolf movie ever made, and there's not even a close second. So again, can't say enough great things about An American Werewolf in London. London, don't watch Paris. Paris is ass. Paris is trash. Watch American Werewolf in London. John Landis is an asshole, but he actually makes a really good movie here. Devil Possession movie. There's a lot of devil possession movies that have been made over the years, but there's only one of them that's like an actual good movie. And that's, of course, William Friedkin's 1974 film, The Exorcist. Now, again, this is a movie from the 70s, so the pacing is different than what we would see today, as was obvious by the Exorcist remake, pseudo sequel that came out just a couple weeks ago. This is a really smart film. Like I did my senior thesis in film school about The Exorcist, and I related it to the Vietnam War and stuff like that. It's super nerdy stuff. This is a movie about a little girl who gets possessed by not the devil, but an ancient Babylonian demon. And her mother has to figure out what is going on. And she exhausts science, and she eventually comes into contact with a priest, Father Damien, who himself is going through a crisis of conscience. So the battle in this movie isn't over the good versus evil, over the soul of the little girl. The battle in this movie is actually over the soul of this faithless preacher, if you will, this priest who has lost connection with God. And I just love the way that religion is played, by Max von Sydow, is old and out of touch and useless, and evil is portrayed by Linda Blair, young, vibrant, terrifying, right? And it's this only the 1970s could have produced something quite like this that's so dour and smart. And I absolutely love The Exorcist. Again, it's a slower paced movie than a lot of people today would really enjoy, if you're looking for the jump scares and the bumps in the night. But this is every devil possession movie that has come after that has been a rub off of The Exorcist. With the exception of Exorcist 3 in 1990, no devil possession movie has ever tried to do something different or unique with the genre. So stick with what works, go with what's good. William Friedkin is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Watch The Exorcist. Ghost story movies. A lot of ghost story movies. I'm going to recommend the one that has the title. In the 1970s, before Stephen King, there was Peter Straub. Peter Straub's big book that made him really a sensation on the writing scene was this book, Ghost Story. It's the book, and the 1981 adaptation is a story about 4 elderly men who live in this college town who get together and tell ghost stories to each other. And what you find out, and this is what they do, is they tell each other spooky stories. And what you find out is when they were young, they made a huge mistake and accidentally killed a young woman. And this is the story of her coming back. And it stars Fred Astaire, Melvin Douglas, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and John Houseman. So these are like big players from generations earlier coming back together to tell this pretty spooky horror story that I think aged really, really well. Alice Krige, was something you might remember from Star Trek First Contact, plays our villain character. She's also the mother from Stephen King's Sleepwalkers. She's so great in this movie. She's scary. She's kind of sexy. She's absolutely terrifying in parts. Like, this is an underrated movie that I think a lot of people have kind of forgotten about. So if you're looking for a good little horror, Halloween horror movie that's a little different, looking for something maybe a little older, I would highly recommend checking out Ghost Story. I think it's aged pretty well. Sci-fi horror. It's not good usually to bend genres, so to say, but if anyone could pull it off, it was John Carpenter, we talked about earlier in Halloween. This is his best film, The Thing. It's a remake of Howard Hawks' 1958, The Thing from Another World. This is the story of a team of research scientists in the Antarctic who have uncovered something that's been unfrozen. And it is a shape-shifting alien that's trying to escape. And this really becomes a great parable story on who can you trust and who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, because you're never quite sure in this movie. Kurt Russell leads the team with Wilford Brimley and Keith David. Like, it's a really great movie. It's absolutely terrifying with some unbelievably great practical special effects that have aged excellent. Like, this, in my opinion, is probably the best horror film ever made. Certainly John Carpenter's best work. It's smart, it's scary, it's brutal. It's a movie that in its era didn't find an audience. Critics hated it. Audiences didn't connect with it. It wasn't until the early 2000s that people revisited this movie and said, hey, this is kind of awesome. And it aged fantastic. And I can't say enough good things about The Thing. Keep an eye on that dog, man. Keep an eye on that dog is all I'm going to say. Slasher movies. I told you before, I sincerely hate slasher movies, but it's Halloween, so I have to recommend something to you from this genre. So what I'm going to tell you is I'm going to tell you to watch a grown-up slasher movie. It's technically a psychological thriller, but it's really the story of a police detective who's investigating a serial killer who they can't figure out is choosing his victims, but they know he's got an obsession with the moonlight. And what they discover is this is a villain called the Tooth Fairy who develops film, right, for Kodak, and he's choosing his victims that way. And then he murders his victims, and he actually shatters mirrors and puts mirrors in their eyes. And this is the story of the police detective named Will Graham, who's out to find him. By the way, this is an adaptation of the Thomas Harris book, Red Dragon. This is also the first film to feature a certain serial killer by the name of Hannibal Lecter. That's right. Will Graham goes to talk to Hannibal Lecter and about how to get inside the head of a serial killer. And this is really a fantastic movie from 1986. This is Michael Mann at the height of his Miami Vice fame. And this is a slick, stylish, neo-noir movie that is a slasher, but it's just so much smarter. It's such a better story. You get a really interesting villain, the Tooth Fairy, Thomas Dollaride, played by Tom Noonan, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And this is our first look at the Hannibal Lecter character. And I don't think there's been a better movie made with it. I think this is a better film than Silence of the Lambs. It's lower budget. It's different. It's got a huge 80s aesthetic to it as far as like the production techniques, as far as like, it's neon, there's neon everywhere. There's an awesome soundtrack that's, again, of the 80s. And if you can kind of get over what the era was specifically and the technique of it, because again, this is Miami Vice era, Michael Mann. It's absolutely awesome. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. I freaking love Manhunter. Comedy horror. Ever since there's been horror, there's been comedy in horror movies. And this is the perfect film that I think is like a great starter horror movie. So if you got a little kid and he's looking, or he or she is looking to get into horror movies, this is the perfect film. It's 1986, The Monster Squad. 1987, excuse me, The Monster Squad. It's a story of three elementary school students who have a club that's kind of dedicated to Universal monsters. And then one day, the monsters come back. When I say monsters, I'm talking about the heavy hitters from Universal Studios: Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, Mummy, and the creature not necessarily from the Black Lagoon, because this wasn't a Universal movie. Universal Studios actually passed when Shane Black and Fred Decker pitched this thing to them. They said, no, we're not interested. But because these are all public domain characters, they went ahead and made the movie anyway. And what you have here is one of the most fun, exciting, like, just a good time at the movies kind of flicks. And it's really, if you like It or something like that, or Stand By Me, a story about kids getting together, this isn't quite as heavy as that. This leans more into the silly, fun stuff. So this is the first horror movie I showed my 7-year-old, and he absolutely loves it. The most famous scene in the movie is the line, kick, and like the Wolfman pins his kid in the corner, and they tell him, kick him in the nards. And then he's like, no, he doesn't have it. And he kicks him. Oh, Wolfman got nards. That's the kind of movie it is. It's fun. It's silly. It's not too serious, but it's a good story. It's a lot of fun. I keep coming back to that when I say what this movie is about. So if you saw this as a kid and haven't seen it in 20, 30 years, give it a revisit. I think you'll be surprised. If you're looking to kind of get your kids into horror and get them excited about the genre, this is the perfect movie to start them off with. Check it out. Check out The Monster Squad. Stephen King movies. What would this podcast be without me talking about Stephen King a little bit? The best adaptation of a Stephen King film is without a doubt 27 horror film specifically. The best is Shawshank Redemption. The best horror film of the Stephen King universe is absolutely 2017's It adaptation. The 1990 one's really good. The 2017 one by Andy Muschietti, the budget's bigger and just it can do a lot more with the material. And I'm talking specifically It Chapter 1. This is the movie that focuses on the aspect of the Losers Club when they're kids. There's always issues about the secondary story when they get older. Quite honestly, those parts of the book aren't as good as the kids stuff. This is the story of a group of kids from a town where lots of bad things happen to kids every 27 years, and the town just kind of ignores it. And as you probably know, because it's, you live in this culture, it's the story of, it's Pennywise the clown. It's an interdimensional being that feeds on fear. And he doesn't just kill kids. He scares them to the point where he consumes their fear. And the murder part of it is just like the icing on the cake. He eats kids just because it scares other kids. And I don't think they could have done this particular adaptation better. They moved the setting from the early 60s into the late 80s. And I think it fits well because people that would want to see this movie are, people my age who grew up with this story. So recycling it into the 80s, it changes some aspects of the book, but I think for the better. And Bill Skarsgård's performance as Pennywise the Dancing Clown, it's different than Tim Curry's. Tim Curry did like the Bob Bell Bozo nightmare clown, whereas Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise is a demon. He's an absolute terror. He's scary from jump. And like you look at Pennywise and I should not be near this clown. But there's also something about him that's kind of like alluring, where it's kind of semi-inviting while at the same time being terrifying. And just his body control and the things that he does without special effects are spooky. And then you turn up the special effects aspect of this, and you have everything that a Stephen King movie adaptation really should be. And I don't think it's ever been done better. Like, I can't say enough good things about this movie. It is probably one of my favorite horror movies. Clearly, that's why it's on the list. It's scary. It's awesome. It's it. Vampires. This is a controversial subject. I don't like sexy vampires. I don't like a vampire story that is a love story. That doesn't appeal to me. When I'm looking for a vampire story, I want monsters. Right. So I'm giving you guys a story about two monsters, two brothers who are criminals, career criminals. They knock over a liquor store and they're on the run from the feds and looking to get away into Mexico. So they hijack a family who's on vacation and they head in a RV to cross into a border town in Mexico where they'll wait for their contacts. And they hole up in this dank, disgusting dive bar just across the border. And it turns out the bar is run by vampires. This is, of course, Robert Rodriguez's From Dusk Till Dawn. This is an all-star extravaganza. You've got Robert Rodriguez behind the camera, fresh off of Desperado when he was one of the hottest young filmmakers. The writers, Quentin Tarantino, fresh off of Pulp Fiction. So you've got a smart script with a director that understands action. The cast is great. You got George Clooney right when he was getting famous. You've got Quentin Tarantino also playing his brother, Harvey Keitel, Juliette Lewis, Fred Williamson, and then the great Tom Savini, the great makeup artist, in a role as as Sex Machine. And of course, Cheech Marin shows up as three different parts, basically steals the movie. It's fun. It's action-packed. It's horrific. It mixes all of these elements really, really well. It's a smart script. It's a smart film on the whole. And I love From Dusk Till Dawn. I think this is an underrated gem. It's not a typical vampire movie. There is a scene with Selma Hayek that kind of walks into the typical vampire movie, but it's played for gross. It's played for horror. It's not like Francis Ford Coppola, and I like Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula adaptation, but it's not Gary Oldman saying, "I've traveled across oceans of time to find you." It's monsters trying to kill people. It's a movie that really works for me because it starts out as this gritty noir, crime story, and then takes this hard left turn into a horror movie. It's just fantastic. If you've never seen From Dusk Till Dawn, check it out. If you have, give it a revisit. And finally, a Universal classic movie, right? These are the guys that started it all. We're talking about German expressionist filmmaking in the 1930s, and the best example of it is James Whale's The Bride of Frankenstein. It's not the first film, but this is when they really figured it out. 1931's Dracula by Todd Browning is a good horror movie. It introduces the universal horror concepts, right? But it's also made in 1931, which is 4 years after the introduction of sound into film. Like, so 4 years after The Jazz Singer comes out. There's long stretches in Dracula that have no sound to it because, like, there's really silent filmmakers. So there's lots of part of it that are unnerving, but not like spooky unnerving, just like awkward unnerving, right? James Whale's Frankenstein is a better made film, but the sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein, now things really click. Now they understand the characters. Clive Owen comes back as Victor Frankenstein. Now we're dealing with his mentor, who's even crazier than he is, and they're gonna build a woman that can marry the monster. And it goes horribly, horribly awry. But again, Boris Karloff really pushes himself this time because he really helps define Frankenstein as this sympathetic monster, right? Like, he doesn't want to be evil. He's just a creature, and people don't understand him, and they're after him. And even when they create this bride for him, played iconically by Eliza Lancaster, like, it doesn't quite work right for him. And that's the story. It's like, I don't want to be a monster, but you're making me be a monster, so I have to be a monster. So if you like the classics and want to check out like the DNA of a good horror film, you got to go with The Bride of Frankenstein. So those are my top 10 picks. Like, they might be a little different than what you might expect, but again, I'm a film nerd. Went to film school, so this is kind of where my brain goes into. And if you've ever read any of my horror stuff, which I highly recommend, it's all on Amazon right now. Hawk Hollow is a really cool book. That's a Halloween horror story that's available. I recommend picking that up. Harvest Moon, another simple werewolf detective story. Very much in the vein of it's basically, if you took Manhunter and mixed it with American Werewolf in London, you would have Harvest Moon. So if you're looking for Halloween horror reads, I can look no further than that. Other than that, Mike and I will be back on Thursday night at 11:30 Eastern time to discuss the happenings of the week. We're going to do a live call-in show. That should be a lot of fun. I fully expect madness. But until then, it's been a lot of fun. This, as always, is the JD Oliva Project. And then see if you recognize the tune that I'm going to close the show with. And then just kind of hit us back up on the Patreon. Let me know if you get the joke. Till next time, we'll see you.
Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. Happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock. Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. Happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
It's almost time, kids. The clock is ticking. Be in front of your TV sets for the Horathon. And remember the big giveaway at 9. Don't miss it. And don't forget to wear your masks.